Hello all. This is the video for Chapter 6, the first of two chapters on the skeletal system. And today we're going to concentrate on bone tissue, formation of bone, and then what happens when bone breaks. Okay, so bone is an organ made up of several different tissues. Make sure you remember it's a tissue. And there's bone, cartilage, dense connective tissue, adipose, and nervous tissue working together. So the entire framework and their cartilages constitute the skeletal system. So the functions of bone, there are several. First of all, it provides support. Secondly, protects the internal organs like the brain, the heart, the lungs. The third is it assists in body movement in conjunction with muscles that pull on the bones to move it. Bones establish mineral homeostasis, where calcium and phosphorus are stored and released as needed. Bone participates in blood cell production or hemopoiesis. And finally, there is some storage of triglyceride for slow release of energy. Okay, so let's get into the structure of bone. So we first will start with the long bone, and I've got a long bone up here on the right, but you have different portions. The middle portion is your diaphysis, and on both ends you have your epiphysis, distal and proximal epiphyses. And then in between the diaphysis and the epiphysis is the metaphysis. Okay, and there is articular cartilage coating each of the epiphyseal ends. There's periosteum, which is a layer of connective tissue that surrounds the diaphysis, and a medullary cavity, which houses the bone marrow, and finally endosteum, which is a thin membrane of the medullary cavity. So the two membranes we have in bone are the periosteum and the endosteum. So bone is a lot of matrix, and there are cells, but they're really dispersed. They're separated by a lot of space. But what is the space? So it's 15% water, 30% collagen, and then 55% crystallized mineral salts, which would constitute calcium and phosphorus. And there are four main cell types that are of interest. The stem cells that produce the bone cells, or osteoprogenitor cells. These stem cells are able to differentiate into the different cells that produce bone. And so the first cell type is the osteoblast, B for bone building, and they secrete a lot of matrix. And then the osteocytes are actually mature osteoblasts. Finally, the osteoclasts are responsible for remodeling bone. Okay, so what's the lineage? Well, you remember the connective tissue mostly comes from mesenchymal cells, and so that's where we get our osteoprogenitor. It then differentiates into an osteoblast, which forms a lot of the matrix and forms the bone tissue, and then it gets trapped in its own bone that it is secreting, and becomes an osteocyte, where then it is just to maintain the bone tissue. The osteoclast is actually a different cell line. This is from white blood cells. And the function of the osteoclast is in resorption of calcium and the breakdown of the matrix in the bone. So long bones have two different portions, the compact exterior, which provides protection and support, and the spongy, lightweight interior. So the compact bone, also called cortical bone, surrounds the spongy bone, and it's heavy and tough and compact in nature. The spongy bone, also called cancellous or trabecular bone, it is found in long bones, and it's where the marrow is. Let's take a look at the compact and spongy bone a little closer. So the compact bone is made of osteons, and osteons are consisting of these concentric rings of lamellae, and in between or in the middle of the osteon are blood vessels. There are blood vessels in the periosteum, and they perforate this bone tissue through what's called Volkmann's canal. And so you can see that the osteons get their blood from the blood vessels that perforate the compact bone. And then we've got a little bit of spongy bone here. We're going to zoom into it on the next slide. But in the medullary cavity of bone, there are a lot of space for bone marrow, and then these trabeculae, these bony processes, and we take a cross section of that. We see that first of all, there are canaliculi, which are little avenues that interstitial fluid can flow to get to these osteocytes, which once again were osteoblasts, and they become trapped in their own matrix. They become osteocytes. The osteocytes reside in a little hole called the lacuna, and these lamellae are the sheets that surround the osteocyte. And then we've got an osteoclast down here. Remember, osteoclast is a different cell lineage. It's actually a white blood cell, and it's going to have very different functions than the osteoblast and the osteocyte. Okay, so there are abundant blood vessels and nerves that innervate bone. So the first is a periosteal artery that enters the diaphysis through Volkmann's canal. I don't have a picture of that here. Well, probably this would be the canal, I guess. And they're, of course, accompanied with veins. So then there's a larger nutrient artery that enters through the diaphysis through what's called the nutrient foramen. And veins also run along this artery. So the metaphysis and the epiphysis, they both have their own arteries and veins. And the nerves that accompany them are sensory nerves, and they're sensitive to tearing, tension. Okay, let's take another look at a cross-section of compact and spongy bone. First of all, we see the periosteum on the outside. Then there are large canals in the medulla of the bone, which are they're central canals, and they are going to give blood and nutrients to the different portions of the bone, compact and spongy. And then we've got Volkmann's canal right here. And then we can see the osteon with the lamellae. So once again, epiphysis, diaphysis, which is a long portion, and then the distal epiphysis. We're going to get into this line in a couple slides. Epiphyseal line, that's really important. And then articular cartilage, which surrounds the entire bone and is more prominent at the epiphyses. Okay, so let's talk about bone formation. This is called ossification or osteogenesis. And bones grow in 4 situations: during embryological development, when the fetus is developing. Then after the child is born, the bones grow up to the end of adolescence, when the individual reaches adulthood. Then there's constant bone remodeling that's occurring, which is affected by exercise. And finally, there's bone formation when there's a fracture. Okay, so ossification has 2 different forms. There's intramembranous, which means between membranes, intra, between, and endochondral. This means inside cartilage. When you see chondral, think about cartilage. So all the bone cells are mesenchymal cells from development that differentiate. Okay, we've got intramembranous ossification, where we've got differentiation of the mesenchymal stem cells to osteoblasts, and finally osteocytes. Then we've got our mesenchymal cells once again, and in endochondral ossification leads to the formation of matrix and bone from a cartilage template. So we'll go through each of these, and let's start with intramembranous ossification. This is what occurs in flat bones, like the flat bones of the skull. And the first step is to develop an ossification center where the osteoblast secretes its matrix. Then calcification ensues, where calcium and other salts are hardened, and you start to form the osteon. And you can see the lacuna where the osteocytes are residing, and then osteoblasts on the outside, which are secreting their matrix. Then the formation of trabeculae, the extracellular matrix. This forms and then follows by the development of the periosteum at the periphery. So this is a formation of flat bones from the different membranes surrounding the bone. More commonly is endochondral ossification. So with endochondral, you start, this is like your long bones, but you start with a cartilage model. And the cartilage model is still shaped like a bone, where you have your diaphysis, your neck, and your 2 epiphyses, proximal and distal. What happens here is mesenchymal cells develop into chondroblasts, which form the cartilage model. And you'll start to get calcification. And this is all happening, by the way, in utero, before birth. In fact, by birth, all the bones will have been matured and replaced, all the cartilage will have been replaced with bone. So the third step is development of the vasculature, and the fourth step, marrow starts to develop in the medullary cavity. Fifth step is development of secondary ossification centers. So these are in the epiphysis, and you start to get a line, which is your epiphyseal plate. This is where growth is going to occur on to make the bone longer. So long bones, endochondral, flat bones would be intramembranous. Okay, let's get into growth. And we're just using a long bone here, but at the epiphysis, and you've got your articular cartilage, which is going to be in the joint. There's different zones, and this is how the long bone grows. So you have resting cartilage on the proximal end, proliferating cartilage, hypertrophic, which means it's getting bigger, and then calcification, and then you've got your bone formation. So new chondrocytes are in this proliferating zone, and then the older chondrocytes, which are more towards the interior, are replaced by bone. And this is going to extend the diaphysis. So this is endochondral ossification, and we're looking at the epiphyseal plate. And if this plate, by the way, is damaged during development, you will not get growth of that bone and probably develop a limp due to the injury, because these epiphyseal plates are very important for growth of bones. Okay, so there's also thickening of bones. So it's not growing longer, but it's growing thicker, but this is the action of osteoblasts and osteoclasts. So we've got our periosteum and our bone formation with the osteocytes in the middle. The second step in forming our osteon is migration and a lot of matrix deposition in this bone to finally form the entire endosteum, which is going to surround the osteon. And there's a blood vessel in the middle of this canal that is necessary for supplying the nutrients to these osteocytes. So the bone grows outward as the osteoblasts build new circumferential lamellae, and these osteons will get layer by layer, and this is how the bone actually thickens. And so you're talking about the diaphysis portion becoming thicker and stronger. Okay, as osteoblasts, which are the mesenchymal cells that are going to lay down this matrix, as they deposit bone on the outer surface, the osteoclasts widen the medullary cavity from within. So in the infant, you have a narrow bone, and then as the adult, as it's lengthening, it is becoming thicker and stronger. So when there's a fracture, there's a number of steps to heal. So we're going to get into the different types of fractures, but after a fracture, you can see a lot of soft cartilage and inflammation. It looks like there's hematoma. You've had blood vessels probably disrupted, and so the challenge is to fill in this break. And so the reparative phase, the dead ends of the bone are taken off, and granulation tissue is deposited, which is the beginning of the matrix. And then we've got new bone that develops over the fracture site. So we can split this up into 3 phases: the reactive phase, which is mostly going to be blood and inflammatory cells that are invading this area, and then the reparative phase, which includes formation of the fibrocartilage and the first bone that's laid down. And then there's a remodeling phase that is the last step where the bone is continually remodeled. Let's take a look at some from fractures. So an open fracture is probably the easiest one to see because the skin has been broken by the trauma or by the bone actually protruding. So a compound fracture is going to be through the skin, whereas a simple fracture will not break the skin. Okay, there's also comminuted when the bone splinters, maybe a crushing incident. There are pieces at the impact site. This x-ray doesn't show a lot, doesn't show the little pieces, but it's not a clean break with protrusions like the open. Okay, so green stick fractures are partial fractures in which one side of the bone is broken, but the other side is not. It's maybe bent a little bit. This is common in children. And there's also impacted fracture when the bone is forced to the interior. This one actually happened right on the surgical neck of the humerus. It's called the surgical neck because it is the most frequently broken portion of the humerus. There are pot fractures, which, for example, the distal end of the fibula. So you can see it almost looks like a hairline fracture of the fibula at the articulation point. And then finally, Coles, which is the fracture of the distal end of the lateral forearm bone, the radius. And the portion of bone is displaced posteriorly. You can see this in the wrist. Okay, so we've covered bone formation. We've covered breaks. Now is to discuss the role of calcium in maintaining calcium homeostasis. And bone stores 99% of the body's calcium. So when we need calcium, we're going to get it from our bone. The hormone that is most involved with this is PTH, or parathyroid hormone. And so you've got a negative feedback system where decreases in blood calcium are sensed by the parathyroid gland, goes into the control center and turns on the release of parathyroid hormone, which then circulates. This is an endocrine hormone, and the effectors are going to be the osteoclasts and the kidney, especially because that's where calcium reabsorption occurs. So in response to this low serum calcium, the kidneys retain more calcium in the blood and then excrete the phosphate, which is the other product. And this is under the control of calcitriol. We'll get more into that later. And so as the calcium levels increase, this feedback system shuts down. So calcitriol is the agent that increases calcium absorption in the intestines. Aging is associated with some bone issues, and bone density, which is a great measure of bone strength and remodeling, shows the increase through childhood and puberty and plateauing in adulthood. And then after menopause, especially after the protective effects of estrogen are relieved, there is, especially in women, there is a decrease in bone density. So exercise can strengthen this. Now, aging is associated with levels of oxidative stress, and what this does is it decreases the osteoblast activity, decreases bone formation, and it can lead to osteoporosis and osteopenia. However, exercise, when you've got strain, stress, muscles pulling on the bone, this is good. This is a good thing. It strengthens the bone, causes more osteoblasts to be created, and then turns on certain genes. This is a chromosome, which increases bone health and will decrease osteoporosis. So there are various factors involved in bone growth, and I don't want you to know all of these. I just want you to have an appreciation for them. So platelet-derived growth factor, fibroblast growth factor, insulin-like growth factor, transforming growth factor, bone morphogenetic proteins, and then factors within nutrition, like calcium intake, vitamin C levels, and vitamin K and B12 levels. So let's look at some of the disorders. We kind of touched on osteoporosis a little bit, but let's start with osteogenesis imperfecta. This is usually caused by a mutation in the collagen gene, and what you get is brittle bones that break very easily. And the diaphysis is the main portion that is brittle. Next, a disorder would be associated with metabolic situation, and this would be rickets, and it's seen in development. So rickets is often seen in children, but vitamin D deficiency will impair the strength of the bone, and we'll get long bones to break and bend. And then osteoporosis, which is calcium deficiency. This leads to little holes in the bone, decreased bone density, and fractures are very common. So with the circulatory system, let's say we've got a joint here and there's an artery that is occluded, maybe a pressure point. This decrease in blood flow will lead to necrosis, and this is osteonecrosis, where the tissue will die. Then there's neoplastic bone effects like osteosarcoma, and with osteosarcoma, it's the osteocyte that has a cell cycle disruption, and it just grows and grows. Certain infections can cause bone injury, like osteomyelitis, which is caused by staph. And really, to measure these situations, the newest bone scans we have out today using nuclear imaging are fantastic in showing whether the bone is osteoporotic, if it is not remodeling properly. So there are various pathologies related to bone problems like bone pain, stress fractures, lesions, infection, and then metastatic cancer. And so all of these will utilize a bone scan, and that'll help diagnose the problem. Okay, that is bone formation in a nutshell, and we'll continue this talk in class on Saturday morning. All right, look forward to Chapter 7 to come out tomorrow.